So good morning. My name is Roger Mark D'Souza. I'm the Director of the Environmental Change and Security Project Program here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. And our program has been very fortunate to have enjoyed a fruitful and dynamic partnership with our friends at USAID's Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation for the past 3 years. And the report that we are launching today, Harvesting Peace, I hope you've all taken your copy of the report, is a result of that partnership. And we're very much looking forward to the discussion that we're going to have today. And prior to the release of the report today, we shared the results of the report with our colleagues at CMM's office and colleagues from Feed the Future. And we were told that this is exactly what was needed right now at this moment in time. Not only does it critically examine these two areas, food security and conflict management and mitigation, but it provides an architecture for these communities to have a meaningful dialogue about where to go next and how to collaborate. And this is perfect. This is perfect for us at the Woodrow Wilson Center because this is exactly what we do here. As many of you know, we are the formal memorial to our 28th president, and we aim to bring the worlds of policy, practice, and academia together to gain a better understanding of how those communities can collaborate. The report that we will discuss today, Harvesting Peace, emerged out of a workshop that we held in 2012, prior to my start here at the center, whereby we brought together 20 experts on food security. Emmy Simmons did a brilliant job of pulling out the themes, questions, and insights from that meeting and weaving them together expertly with her own in-depth research into how food security and conflict affect each other. Emmy, as many of you know, has a long career with USAID and was able to propose a set of recommendations specific to development programming around food and conflict that resonates with development programs. Two of our panelists, Ed Carr and Henk-Jan Brinkman, were part of that workshop in 2012, and we're pleased to have them here today to comment on the report. Susan Bradley is the chief of the technical division in the country's Strategy and Implementation Office of USAID's Bureau for Food Security, with her focus on reducing risk and building economic resilience in chronically poor and crisis-prone populations. She's an example of the target audience and who we're trying to reach with these results. So we're really delighted to have you here today to be part of this dialogue. I'd also like to recognize two colleagues at the center whose work and support for this project has really enabled us to advance this work. Lauren Hertzer-Risi, who managed the project, and Jeff DeBalco, Professor and Director of Environmental Studies at the Vancouver School of Leadership and Public Affairs at Ohio University, and formerly the director of this program at the Wilson Center. So thank you, Lauren and Jeff. So I'm pleased to introduce the moderator for today's session, Joe Hewitt. Joe was instrumental in informing the structure and content of the report and guiding it through to the final version. He's on the technical leadership team at CMM, where he's a specialist in international conflict, with a particular focus on forecasting armed conflict and political instability. It's been our pleasure to work with him, with Cynthia Brady and Kirky Wheeling at CMM, and we're thrilled to have Joe lead today's discussion. So, Joe?
Great. Thank you, Roger Mark. I'm delighted to be here, and it's wonderful to finally be at this point where we can present the culmination of a lot of work over a long time. First off, I just want to thank the Wilson Center for their really supreme partnership in this and a lot of the other endeavors that we're involved with our own work that we do broadly in natural resource management and conflict. The Wilson Center has this enormous amount of horsepower that has allowed our office to achieve a number of things that we're really quite proud of. So I really want to thank you, Roger Mark, and Lauren for all of the work, for Jeff DeBalco, for the work previous. It has really led to a lot of things that we feel really proud of. we started this, as Roger Mark said, with, I guess I would say with the drought in the Horn of Africa in 2011, when our office began to get a number of queries inside the agency about how the drought was going to relate to conflict. Surely, the increase in food insecurity was going to drive conflict in this part of the world that was already very fragile and conflict affected in ways that would be very significant. Surely that would be the case. And that was the intuition. So the queries sort of went, what can you tell us specifically about what the implications are for development programming based on that? And we didn't have an answer, because in fact, the connections between food security and conflict were not well understood. This is an emerging area of scholarship. It's an emerging area for scholar practitioners. And we realized it was important to get smart as we could on this right away. And this is where our partnership with the Wilson Center, how the partnership with the Wilson Center often works. We convened an expert workshop. We put together an amazing group of people, and we're really fortunate to have a couple of them with us right now, at least 3 of them, including Emmy. And we figured out at that point what the agenda was. And we then left it to Emmy with the Herculean task of synthesizing all of that, helping us understand how conflict affected food security, and then the reciprocal relationship, how food security affected conflict, and then tease from that what the development implications are. And she did that. And this report, Harvesting Peace, summarizes all of that in a way that I think is accessible and useful for whether you're an implementer, a scholar, you work for a development actor, a donor. It has value in all those dimensions. So I'm really pleased that we're going to have a chance this morning to walk through the main findings. Emmy will walk us through the main findings. And then we're going to have comments from 3 panelists in this order. Susan Bradley, who is a division chief at the Bureau for Food Security. Then Henk-Jan Brinkman, who is going to provide a perspective where he sits at the United Nations. He's Chief of Policy in the Planning and Application Branch of the United Nations Peacebuilding Support Office. And then finally, Ed Carr, who's a professor of geography at the University of South Carolina. He's a former AAAS fellow at USAID and has this unique perspective of knowing how USAID works on the inside, but also brings a perspective from the academic community, which is going to be really helpful. My job is just to be the traffic cop, and I'm going to sort of keep time and all of that. There's going to be a full hour for Q&A, so I really invite you to think about what you're hearing as we move through the morning, and think about questions that you'd like to pose or comments that you'd like to add. Let's all recognize that this is an emerging area of knowledge and practice, and so there are no you hear this too often, but there are no stupid questions. It's important to get all of the questions and comments on the table. And so with that, I'm going to start by giving the floor to Emmy Simmons so that we can begin to get a sense of the highlights of this important paper. So Emmy?
Thank you. And I have a PowerPoint to help. Thank you, Joe, for that, and Roger Mark for those introductions, and thanks to the Wilson Center and CMM at USAID for the opportunity to actually work on this area. I was privileged to be at that one-day workshop brainstorming about a little over a year ago, and found how little I knew about the sort of field of conflict analysis and peace-building analysis. So while I have a long history in food security and have worked in USAID for almost 30 years, and prior to that, worked in food and agriculture issues in Nigeria and Liberia, nevertheless, I was a neophyte when it came to some of the conflict and peace-building work that I was hearing about that day. So when Lauren and Jeff came to me after the meeting, Cynthia Brady, Joe, said, well, you know, it would be useful if somebody just kind of wrote this down and pulled it together, because clearly you know, the two communities are not talking to each other. I said, well, you know, that would be interesting. Back in 1991, I was in Ethiopia as a USAID officer in the regional office in East Africa. And that country had just terminated a war. And the mission director, who until that time had done nothing but to deliver food aid in a time of conflict, came to our regional office and said, look, I have no staff, but I now need to build a development program and figure out how this country is going to move forward. So it was an exciting opportunity. It was a challenging opportunity. And at the time, I really wish I'd had a book like this, as well as a book that Jay Smith has written on economic growth and agriculture and kind of building those kind of programs. In any case, I hope that this little sort of monograph begins a process of closer collaboration between folks who work on food security issues in fragile states, in conflict-affected states, and those who are working on conflict analysis and peace-building analysis and on the efforts that support that. So that's kind of what I'm going to talk about. The paper deals with 5 things. One of the things we've tried to do is put the issues of food and conflict into the same frame, and to ask 2 key questions. The first question is, how does conflict affect food security? And actually that turned out to be a piece of cake, no problem, easy to answer. The second question, how does food insecurity contribute to conflict, is why the Wilson Center way underpaid me. Because that question is a heck of a lot harder to answer. And Henk-Jan, I'm sure, will understand this and comment on this as well. The third sort of point that's covered in the paper is trying to define conflict and look at the risk of conflict. And what I've done in the paper is take a very broad perspective, considering violent, non-violent, short-term, long-term, sustained, nationwide, interstate, intrastate. So when I say conflict, it means any or all of those things. But I also looked at it in sort of a time sense that and this comes from a lot of the conflict work, is that conflict kind of has a life. It starts, it goes on for a while, it kind of dies, and then in many cases it reignites. So the recovery and the reignition kind of relationship is one that I found particularly of interest and particularly important for development programming. The fourth issue that the paper deals with is the question of, okay, so this is the situation, this is what happens, this is what we understand about the processes of food security, food insecurity, and conflict. And what you notice is that the external community, people external to the conflict, have to help. And often that's a humanitarian assistance group that helps, but sometimes it's official help, sometimes it's military help. So that question about how help is delivered, how it's defined, how it becomes essential and becomes part of the conflict food insecurity kind of equation is important. And then I conclude the paper with some points for some thoughts for USAID. This is kind of the face of conflict that we all saw in 2008. Around the world, as prices spiked, we saw people going into the streets, holding up signs, in this case even with matching T-shirts, with signs saying, "Away with high food prices." Food is really fundamental to people's daily existence, and the price or their access to that food is clearly important to them. And people will turn out in the streets when that price spike is unanticipated. So this is a common phenomenon. In 2008, there were at least 40 demonstrations, conflicts in cities around the world. Some turned violent, some did not turn violent, but this was a common picture. But it's not just enough to kind of look at that, at that picture and say, oh, well, you know, people go out in the streets and, well, that's it. Let's hope they don't kill each other. But it's really important, if you're looking at it in terms of causality, to sort of say what's behind it. And as I said, in 2008, the food price spike, which really affected everyone worldwide, was clearly the sort of push point that got people out in the streets. But that even that wasn't the whole thing. The part of the rest of the picture had to do with trends in urbanization. The fact that in Asia, much more than half of the population is living in cities. It does not produce its food, has no fallback when markets change. And in Africa, in many countries, again, the proportion of the population that lives in cities that must rely on markets, must relate to prices for their food supply, for their food security, lives in cities. South Africa has over 70% of its population living in cities. While we still think of it as very much of an agricultural country, from a food consumption perspective, it's an urbanized country. The other issue is the agriculture issue. This is not actually a very clear slide here, but you have these lines going up, and then you have one line sort of bumping along the bottom. That is the line of per capita production in agriculture in Africa. So you look at the situation, growing populations, growing urbanization, spiking food prices on the global market. You look at production per capita in Africa, and you realize that, in fact, the cushion of security that local food production provides is a very, very thin cushion indeed. So it brings together agriculture prices, urbanization, demographic change, and that lies behind those away with high food prices signs that people are holding in the street. This is a picture that's more recent, the Arab Spring picture, which many people feel is causally related to the issue of high food prices, and particularly, and to government policy. Government policy basically just prior to the Arab Spring had started to move subsidies for bread, a staple commodity in North Africa, in Egypt particularly, more toward market prices. As you can see, the guy is holding his bread and saying, no, the subsidies cannot go down. They need those subsidies. The food story is so intertwined with the story of the Arab Spring that it's a story that we need to pay attention to even as that Arab Spring continues. But this is the other face of conflict, and this is, as I said, I include everything in conflict from street demonstrations, and this is food as war as food and food as war. And this is a story which Mark Cohen, who's sitting in the office, and his colleague Alan Messer, I think, have really written about in a very compelling way. And it's a picture from Darfur, where in fact the strategy of war was the strategy of destruction of food and the capacity to produce food. So when you see this kind of picture, this is the other extreme. Peaceful demonstrations where everybody yells and then goes home and grumbles and does what they need to do for their food security, that's one thing. But in this case, this is devastating. This is long term. So in the paper, I try to take a look at what do we know. And as I said, I was a neophyte in the whole literature of conflict and peace building. So I'm delighted that Henk Jan is here today, because I know he's worked on this a heck of a lot longer than I. But there is a lot of data out there. There's a lot of data on conflict. There's a lot of data on food security. It is rarely brought together. There are lots of hypotheses about what causes food security and what causes conflict. And I have to say, as I do in the paper, that the theory of conflict and the kind of econometric analysis that supports that theory is actually a hell of a lot stronger in the conflict area than it is in the food security area, which was surprising to me. And there's also a very, very large literature on experience with interventions. As I said, a conflict and in a time of great and obvious food insecurity it does require international action in most cases. And that intervention, that support, that help has generated experiences that we can learn from. So I've principally focused on this first question. How does conflict affect food security? And as I said in the introduction, this is just a really easy question to answer. And the answer is in every way. It affects availability, it affects access, it affects utilization of food, it affects the predictability and certainty with which people can access their food supplies. Conflict invariably leads to food insecurity. So even if it may not be caused, even if conflict may not be caused by food insecurity, it always causes it. The availability in there, I give many examples from many, many countries about how it disrupts production, it causes people to flee, it puts landmines into the land that people need to produce on. It generates mining activities, artisanal mining activities for diamonds, for gold, which disrupt and upset and provide environmental pollution for agriculture. It disrupts flows of food, so even markets can't operate where conditions are very insecure. It reduces the pipeline of investments. Governments are busy fighting the war, so therefore they're not so busy investing in agriculture and increasing the food supply. On the access side, I think we've seen many cases of forcible displacement. We're seeing it right now in Syria, as people are talking about people in Jordan, people in Lebanon, people in Turkey. We see price rises as access is more difficult and people take advantage of broken markets and non-functioning markets. I could go on, but I'll leave this, and there's lots of examples in the paper. What I do want to point out, though, is, and this is sometimes overlooked, is that conflict not only has short-term impacts in terms of access, availability, utilization, and certainty, but it has long-term impacts. And the most stunning long-term impacts are the impacts that derive from children who are less than 2 having inadequate supplies of quality food. There are measured studies that show that 20 years later, the earning capacities, the intellectual capacities, the physical health of those kids who were born and grew up during that period of conflict is irreversibly affected for the rest of their lives. That very short war between Eritrea and Ethiopia at the end of the 1990s actually has generated data that shows levels of stunting of small children that we know from other nutritional work will last them their entire lifetime. And this is the tough question. How does food insecurity contribute to conflict? Okay, this took a heck of a lot of time trying to figure out whether, in fact, we had good quantitative data, whether we had good causal analysis to be able to figure this out. And in the end, I came up with these 5 terms. And I'm dying to hear what Ed and Hank Jan are going to say about this, because these 5 words are triggering conflict, catalyzing recurrent conflict, building momentum toward conflict, providing incentives to join or support conflict, or sustaining conflict. That is by constant churning around food insecurity, actually sustaining conflict. A couple of examples on triggering conflict. The picture that I showed of the people in the streets, that is a well-known, widespread, repeated, often sort of contributor to trigger for conflict. Food riots are well-known, well-studied as a phenomenon in themselves. As I said, sometimes they're violent, sometimes they're not. The catalyzing recurrent conflicts, I think, the food insecurity that seems to be related to resources, where the pastoralists want access to the water, the farmers want access to the water and want to plant irrigated crops along the edge of the water through which the cattle are supposed to move. That is the food needs of both of those groups and the food security objectives of both of those groups, I assert, are what helps to catalyze recurrent conflicts. again and again and again. Political leadership that emerges from conflict often can build on food security related grievances. So food security builds momentum for conflict by sort of aggravating the grievances that people feel, and then those grievances can be turned into political capital by other folks. It also builds momentum to conflict when there is embezzlement of funds that are intended to relieve food insecurity, and those funds are allocated politically somewhere else. Again, it raises tensions, it raises the potential for conflict. Feelings about injustice is where, especially again in resource-rich countries, where people who are poor, people who are food insecure, feel that they're not getting their fair share. They can see the national wealth, as in oil, and they say, this is not right. Again, it's that grievance, it's the incentive, it's the sort of triggering of conflict which results. Weak governance obviously is part of sustaining conflict, and people who feel they have very little to lose, that they're poor, they don't have jobs. Why not? Why not? There's a chance, and this gets into the micro-literature on young men willing to join conflict, willing to support conflict, because they're not going to be food secure no matter what under the current circumstances. So if they take a chance, if they join the conflict, you know, the guerrilla leaders have promised them that they're going to be rich, they're going to be better off. Why not do that? I think you've seen that in the civil wars in both Sierra Leone and Liberia, as well as Colombia, where the sort of incentive structure to sort of get in there and use the conflict to advance one's own personal food security is fairly strong. So intervening to help, as I said, the international community does feel obliged to help when food insecurity rises, either as a result of conflict or when it appears that food insecurity is so serious that it may trigger, catalyze, sustain, etc., conflict. And the interventions that I kind of identified look into that the humanitarian imperative of feeding the hungry. And in fact, the principles of humanitarian assistance clearly lay this out, that in fact, it is obliged to, that humanitarian organizations are obliged to help in spite of conflict and to be neutral in a dealing with it. And that feeding the hungry often goes along with rebuilding lives and livelihoods in the post-conflict period. Replacing and restructuring institutes of governance is another key target for the help that is provided in conflict and post-conflict situations. Helping households recover, especially if conflict always increases food insecurity, recovering always involves interventions that will address food and agriculture issues. Often the help involves mobilizing civil society and the private sector, because civil society will help to start, especially in a post-conflict period, help to start rebuilding the networks, the social networks, the governance networks, the communication networks that are going to sort of engender the recovery overall. And the private sector is necessary to regenerate jobs, to regenerate investments, to invest in agriculture, get the production engine moving. And intervening to help, however, is always fraught. And in the paper, you'll find a long review or a use of some work that was done by Luca Alanovi, in which he talks using some great case study material from 3 countries in Africa about how important it is to understand what's going on. Because all of those other interventions can go well, but they can also go badly. And he advocates for why it's so critical as one is intervening to help to actually address to really dig deeply into understanding the causes of both food insecurity and conflict. So I conclude the paper with some thoughts for USAID. As an old USAID person, how could I not make recommendations, right? But it's also I felt it was also important to do this because when you look at the administration's efforts in Feed the Future and you realize how many of the Feed the Future countries have either experienced conflict, are fragile in terms of governance, are recovering from conflict, as Liberia and now Mali, you cannot do Feed the Future food and agricultural focused assistance without recognizing the interplay of conflict, peace building, food, and agriculture. So the term of conflict sensitive development assistance has emerged. I think it's a great term. And I think that that is, in some ways, the big challenge for Feed the Future. So I'm happy Susan's here. One of the questions is whether, in fact, one can break the cycle of conflict and fragility by actually improving agricultural development, and how that might work, and how it can, through conflict-sensitive agriculture development, advance the situation and actually reduce those conflict contributing factors, reduce the triggers, reduce the catalytic effect, reduce the momentum, etc. The one issue that I can't resist pointing out, however, is that USAID and other agencies, even in conflict areas, tend to have short attention spans. Well, let's get in there, let's help folks recover, 2 or 3 years, that should do it. The literature is so strong on this, that recovery from conflict is the work of a generation or more. And that means not just planning for 2 years, 3 years, sort of getting a few new seeds out there, seeds of hope, for example, just getting those seeds out there, making sure that people, get their farms back, but actually figuring out how the larger context of conflict is going to be restructured. The one area, again, that I think deserves huge focus from USAID and its implementing partners and NGOs is the microeconomic situation. Often we talk about fragile states and we talk about sort of countries being in conflict. But in fact, the record is that intra-state conflicts are growing. That is the dominant view of conflict, as in Syria. And therefore, one needs to take a microeconomic approach. How are the communities doing? How are the households doing? The data on microeconomic responses to conflict, the data on microeconomic level of households' recovery from conflict, this is really informative. There's a whole network called Microcon, which is publishing some just really, really important work on this kind of recovery, dealing with issues like recovering of property rights, recovering of education, helping children who, as I said, have been seriously affected in terms of their health and nutrition, helping them to get back onto at least a reasonable situation. So that microeconomic approach, I think, is one that we need to take. I won't go into my long peroration here about how I think also this raises a policy question for USAID, because when a coup happens at the national level, the law requires USAID to stop assistance. And yet, at the microeconomic level, at the community level, especially in areas that are not directly affected by fighting, that is the worst possible signal to be given. So I conclude with a few recommendations for a learning agenda, because I think this is an area, again, I thank CMM and Wilson Center for the opportunity to work on this, because I think this is an area in which the conflict people have actually, and the peace building people, have actually sort of made a coherent and sort of focused effort to understand causality. Whereas I think in the food security side, our understanding of causality, and this is as a person who's worked in food security for more than 40 years, our sort of rigorous understanding of causality of food insecurity or food security is actually somewhat deficient. But I do believe that those folks who are doing conflict analysis could actually incorporate more explicitly elements of the food security picture and contribute through that joint analysis to our understanding of how to go forward to address issues and challenges of food security in a time of fragility and conflict and weak governance in so many countries. So, thank you.
Emmy, thank you so much. That was fantastic. There are multiple issues on the table to think about. I'll flag a couple of things.
Go ahead.
Get your pen. Let me just flag not a couple things, just a quick list of things right away just to think about before I hand the floor over to Susan Bradley. Food security does not cause conflict in the way that applying heat causes water to boil. The relationship is not that simple, and that is why Emmy was underpaid by the Wilson Center to develop at least kind of a schematic of all the issues. Food security, perhaps the best way to talk about it is that it joins other factors that relate to conflict. But the relationship is, as social scientists sometimes say, is conditioned by factors relating to governance, factors relating to the grievances that are held by people, factors relating to the relationships between different communities, as you said, at the micro level. These are all things that are worth thinking about. And then, of course, from the development perspective, how do we break a cycle, as Emmy said? By trying to break the relationship between food insecurity and conflict through more conflict-sensitive agricultural programming. Those are all issues we need to think about, plus many more. So I just want to shine a light on some of those things as we move along in the conversation. I'm going to turn it over now to Susan Bradley.
Thank you very much. First, I'm very pleased to be here. I'm also pleased, although I sort of approached the task with fear and trepidation, I'm pleased that Emmy's paper is out there, actually. I think it's really going to help us. I think it's going to help my own bureau with some very, very sticky issues. That said, in talking about the paper with some of my colleagues, we felt ourselves hungering for sort of an organizational frame to sort of to unpack the term conflict and then to sort of organize thought around the different kinds of conflict. If you don't, it is such an enormous, amorphous problem. I mean, you might as well just use the word violence as opposed to conflict. And so actually, I sort of directed from Emmy's paper, she sort of points you to read Mr. Brinkman's paper on this addressing a similar topic. And in that paper, you find a sort of unpacking into the categories civil conflict, interstate war, democratic breakdowns, protests and rioting, and communal violence. And Emmy talks about this in the annex of her paper a little bit. But I found that breakdown actually very useful. And I can see that in terms of operationalizing a lot of this thinking, it would be useful just to go to a simple frame that sort of says, in this kind of context, think about these things. In this kind of context, even though there's going to be a huge overlap and there'll be complexities when you're in a context where you've actually got three of the same things going on at the same time. My second thought, oh boy, I'm gonna have to apologize. My note sort of for this one is squishy. That's what it says, squishy. So for the very analytical among you, just be patient. Emmy's discussion, when she breaks out, she provides the definition of food security being access, availability, access, utilization, and stability. But she pushes that stability out a little bit, and she says it's not just stability of supply, but certainty of supply. And that sort of emphasizes the fact that conflict, it doesn't only undermine the actual flow of food and the actual sort of stable sourcing of food, but it undermines people's confidence in that. And that, in my mind, opens up this huge door. It's just a huge door because you've moved from something that you can measure pretty simply to perceptions and people's perceptions of those things. And I don't think we've pushed ourselves quite far enough in thinking about that concept. Now this is where I really do get squishy, but please. I sort of started my food security world, if you would, back in the mid-'80s. I was sent by Carr International out to Timbuktu in Mali, where they were experiencing relatively severe drought. And I remember driving up, there was no road at that point, sort of, unless you went through Gao and around. But we were driving, we'd drive past villages, and as we were getting closer and closer and closer to Timbuktu, we would pass villages where there were actually storehouses, or like buildings made of sacks of grain, food commodities, US government food commodities that had been distributed and had been recollected, and they were made into houses. And in those same villages, which we would actually go and visit and do food needs assessment, there were children dying. And it was incomprehensible to me what was going on that this could be. I learned, more and more as we went along that, okay, there's a system of credit and people have to repay and it's part of the social thing. But the fact that there were stores of food and starvation going on in the same place made me understand that I really didn't understand people's perceptions of their own food insecurity, of how that fit into the broader community view of food insecurity. I'll jump from there to another sort of maybe more controversial thing. Emmy will remember, I think, right after the bombing in Kosovo, of course, the US government rode in full force with food assistance. And I was right there at the head of that. And there was a lot of hue and cry about how could we be bringing so much food into this situation. People aren't starving, people aren't dying, people aren't this and that. Well, one of the things that struck me there was that for a Kosovar family, if they did not have a sack of grain in their basement for each person in their family, they were starving. That to them was starvation. That was food insecurity, and the kind of fear and tension and confusion and angst that had, really, it affected behaviors. And I know that because I saw it, I know that where distributions were slowed down because of fears of mines or whatever else, that fear and tension probably fueled reprisals. So it's a whole different way of thinking. And I could go on and on with examples that sort of indicate that people's own ideas about what food security is and isn't are very different and have nothing to do with necessarily with the household hunger index, or even what we think of in terms of measuring coping strategies. No, it's something more specific to cultures and households. And I really think we have to dig at that, because to me, that's a linchpin when we think about how these feelings can be manipulated or leveraged or mitigated. And there's strong relationship with conflict in using those ideas. So it's just a plea, or maybe it points back to something that runs through Emmy's paper, the need for better understanding, need for a very context-specific analysis. Third point, really quickly, is water. The definition of food utilization that was used in USAID's 1995 Food Aid and Food Policy paper is narrower and a lot stuffier than the definition that Emmy has in her paper. And I'm not going to read it, but you'll have to trust me. What it is, it basically focuses on diet, water and sanitation, and knowledge. Those are the three pieces of utilization in that 1995 definition. And I like it because it does bring more prominence to the issue of water, even if that is tied to nutrition and not access and utilization. The point is that I think we need to do, Emmy's paper says, water security is incredibly important, particularly when you're thinking about conflict over natural resources. But I think we need to really do quite a bit more work looking at this issue of water security in our food security in our food security work, and certainly in this examination of the intersection between food security and water. I think that USAID's new water strategy is going to help us do that, because it actually has a strategic objective that is specifically about water's role in agriculture and food systems, and the sustainability of those systems. I also know that FuseNet is beginning to deepen its own sort of exploration of this idea of water and food security, water security, if you would. And there's certainly good work being done outside of USAID. I know that the Food Economy Group did some fantastic work in Ethiopia, for example, looking at the role of water in a household budget and what happens when high food prices squeeze the amount of money that's available for water, when significant parts of the community are having to buy water for their own use. So certainly, as we also think forward to the impacts of climate change, understanding what's going on in terms of water security is going to be at the center of that. All right. I would not be doing my colleagues justice if I didn't say that gender was given a very light touch in this paper. And I won't go on about it. I'll just say we all know that the intersection between gender impacts and conflict, and particularly gender-based violence in conflict situations, has to have more attention. It has to be dealt with sort of in a more impactful or efficient way. And I actually think if we go back to the idea of framing and unpacking conflict by what kind of conflict it is, it might help us further the analysis of what kinds of gender impacts are occurring along that. So with Feed the Future, I wish I could say that we were making huge strides and we had embraced the CMM's conflict assessment framework in every country. I can't really say that. I will say, though, that in terms of the agency, the CDCS process, which is the country development cooperation strategies, are actually creating space to do a much better job to be looking at an issue like conflict across the entire mission. I will also say that there is good news on the Feed the Future front. Several of the recommendations that Emmy makes in her paper are actually sort of in train. I think Feed the Future is deeply engaged in the agency's resilience work. We're doing quite a bit of work both in the Horn and the Sahel with a wide range of sort of agency partners. Hugely better integration of Food for Peace and Feed the Future is going on, helped largely through the community development funds and push towards food aid reform. In Haiti, we're working together to put together a safety net program, which actually responds directly, I think, to several of the recommendations made throughout the paper. Teams going out to Mali next month, sort of a joint across the agency team to look at what can be done to sort of redesign strategies, what can be done to really increase the impact of our work in Mali on both resilience but also reducing the probability for conflict. Also coming up, an increased focus on looking at political economy, political economy analysis, which I think when you break it down sort of simply, it's looking at winners and losers of our investments. I think that this is really important in terms of the kind of conflict analysis you might want to do if you're designing a policy agenda, for example. And in terms of policy agenda, much of the work that we're doing directly affects some of the most critical pieces, I think, of drivers of conflict, things like land tenure, gender integration, the equability of growth and investment. I could stop, but I won't. I'll mention two more things. We're actually jumping into a process of forecasting or futures that are going to look at trends, things like the recent report out of USDA, the ERS report that's looking at trends through, I think it's 2023. What's going to be happening in terms of food security in Malawi, for example, or Ethiopia, or Uganda. And in two of those, Malawi and Uganda, food security is actually going to, or according to this projection, will deteriorate significantly if we don't make some major changes now. One of those changes is, of course, reflected in the UN report, population report, which talks about unexpected increases in population, so the pressures that these demographic changes are going to have. This kind of forecasting absolutely is what we need to be doing if we're going to be anticipating and thinking about the probability of conflict. What else? Nope. I'll stop. I'll say again, I really enjoyed and I learned quite a bit from both papers. And I very much anticipate and enjoy listening to what's going to be coming up with Ed and Han-Ying.
Great. Thank you, Susan. And thank you for so clearly helping to shine a light on why this is so complex. I mean, you hear things like, sure, you want to understand the relationship between food security and conflict, but conflict emerges in several different ways, and the causal logics behind those different ways that conflict emerges are all different. A riot is different than a full-scale civil war. A full-scale civil war is a whole lot different than intercommunal conflict that doesn't involve the government. Mass protests may be nonviolent, but they are a form of conflict. There is disagreement between the people protesting and a government. So sorting all of that out is important. The local context is important. Perceptions of what constitute food security or food insecurity can vary across contexts. So all of these things are important, and thank you for putting a lot of these issues on the table. Let's turn to Henk-Jan Brinkman to get his perspective from an international organization, the UN, and from a person who has spent a long time thinking about these issues. Henk-Jan?
Great. Thanks a lot, and thanks a lot for inviting me. Really thrilled to be here and see the result of the work that was started in this workshop in this room a few months ago. I think I fully agree. It's a very great report. I mean, it's really so comprehensive, and it's probably the most comprehensive in this particular area. And I really admire the work of that, and fully acknowledge the difficult part, which is indeed on the relationship between violence and the consequences for food security. That's pretty straightforward, and a lot of work on that in all those dimensions that you went through, from availability to utilization and stability. But the other direction is really the more difficult part. I fully agree. And there is some interesting work out there, and I think you summarized it really superbly. But I think what is actually the most important and perhaps the most difficult part, and that's where is the last chapters on the intervention and the programming. That is really what is absolutely key. And I think that's where I think we still have to learn a lot more. And it's so relevant. And that's why I will talk a little bit about that, and that's where I think a peace-building approach is really important, and it gets to your point about the short attention span. You cannot just have a short attention span in terms of short-term food security interventions. In these kind of situations, you really need to think long-term to make sure that you really address the issues. Just to start, and I think you referred to that in your presentation and also the report, is that what is so important is that the nature of conflict, I think, is changing so dramatically in the world we live in. When the UN was founded, we basically had mostly wars between states, and that moved to wars of independence, to civil wars. But now, actually, except for this dreadful war that's going on in Syria, the kind of forms of violence that we see are much more amorphous and are much more diverse. We're involving non-state actors, often only non-state actors. We're talking about gangs and organized crime and just plain homicides. I mean, the death rates, the violent death rates in Guatemala at the moment are higher than during the Civil War. So this is the kind of conflicts and violent conflicts, and I fully agree we need to move to the term violent conflict. Conflicts are everywhere, and conflicts are not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, that's how societies make progress. They're inherent in human relationship that there are conflicts. What we're really talking about is violence, and the institutions to manage those conflicts, that they don't deteriorate into violence. And that, of course, in societies where you don't have democratic structures or institutions in general, that channels these conflict relationship is very key. So what we see at the moment is really a persistence of a lot of violent conflicts that are really very intractable. A lot of little wars with no battlefields and no front lines and no clear conflict zones and no combatants and uniforms and no ideology. Often it's not even clear what the violence is about. And those, of course, are much more difficult to address. I mean, they're often multidimensional. The factors change over time and change from one group to the other. And traditional instruments, I think, of diplomacy and military intervention are often not working. Certainly not if they're not complemented by a much broader socioeconomic approach. And of course, that's where I get to the food security part. I do think very much, as Joe said, food insecurity is often not a direct cause or the only cause. It's what we call a threat multiplier. And they only are relevant in combination often with other factors. And it's that contextual approach that is so important. And it's what Emmy in her paper referred to, the building momentum, and it's the other factors that are really critical. And then if you then suddenly have a food price spike, or fundamental inequalities within a country with regard to food insecurity, that things really are problematic. So the low development, hybrid political regimes, a youth bulge of many, 20, 25-year-old men doing nothing, and the horizontal inequalities within a society that is really critical. So this vicious cycle from violence to food insecurity and from food insecurity to conflict is really what needs to be broken. And I think I would go a little bit further than you do in the paper, talking about conflict-sensitive development, which I think is absolutely critical. But I would go one step further, and that having a peace-building approach. So the conflict-sensitive approach is, putting simple, is trying to avoid a negative outcome. But a peace-building approach, you really try to have a positive effect on peace relations within a country. So it's conflict sensitivity would mean you work in a conflict, but with peace building you would actually work on a conflict and make sure that it contributes to peace building. And I think there is often an approach, and that is changing rapidly, luckily, and I think this kind of paper and this kind of work is really contributing to that. That in the past it often be the approach that if you provide food assistance in a country that is in conflict or coming out of a conflict, that by definition would help to address the issue, and that's not the case. You can cause as many problems by providing food assistance as you solve. By providing it to one ethnic group, or providing it the whole issue in Sudan about the relationship between the government and WFP being accused of providing aid to the rebels and things like that. So having a proper analysis and making sure that you are contributing to peaceful relations in society and contribute to peace building over the longer term is really absolutely critical. To put perhaps an example from another discipline is in terms of education. There's this great example in Andrew Natcio's paper about the counter-bureaucracy, about building schools in Afghanistan. Just building a school and reporting back to Washington, money spent, school built, check. But not consulting with the local community where the school needs to be built, not having an education department in place that can provide the teachers and the curriculum, and the content of the curriculum is very critical, not involving local contractors to make sure that there is spin-offs in terms of construction and economic incentives to the local communities is all critical factors. That maybe takes a little bit more time than just bringing in Halliburton and building a school, but it is absolutely critical to build a social and relationship within a country. So if I may then just move to how we could actually incorporate a peace-building approach into food security programming. And I do think that is the most difficult part. Within the UN, one of my favorite quotes is a colleague at one point said, the greatest conflict analysis I ever saw was in Guinea-Bissau, but all they could come up with in terms of recommendations was support the fishery sector. That is the conflict analysis we have learning a lot about, and a lot of tools out there that is absolutely critical. But then translating the conflict analysis into good programs that avoid having a negative effect on peace is difficult, and we still really have to learn quite a bit. And you need to have a theory of change. You need to be able to highlight, how can this intervention build on build a peace, and what are the mechanisms to do that. And I'm not a big advocate of log frames, but you do need to think a little bit through what the causal or mechanisms are through which you might create positive results. And I want to identify 4 pathways that might be important. The first one is building institutions and capacity, including to manage conflict, but also to deliver services. An example would be what WFP and FAO, I think with some international partners as well, building a food security monitoring system in Nepal to have an early warning capability. And what was so important about that is that all different groups in society knew now that the government was actually monitoring their food insecurity, irregardless of where they are, what ethnicity they were, and had a response mechanism accordingly. Were you involved in that, Gary, or no? Okay. So I'm not making a mistake. I'm not mentioning you. The second mechanism is addressing the root causes, and you refer to that as well. Like in the civil war in Liberia and Sierra Leone, there was one of the really fundamental factors was the disparities between the capital and the outlying rural areas in social services, in schools and health facilities, but of course also in social protection and food assistance systems. So if you, through your interventions, can make sure that you really have an equitable approach to different groups in society, I think it really is very important. Thirdly, enhancing social cohesion. So that's really about society to society relationships. And there are some great examples, both in the report that I did and elsewhere, about how food assistance programs can really help build social cohesion within a society. And often those effects are bigger than actually, the effects on nutrition or the effects on skills training. For example, in Kyrgyzstan, there is a water management project that really makes sure that the management committees are including both the Uzbeks and the Kyrgyz together. So that building these relationships between groups is critical. In Mindanao, the school committees that manage the school feeding program is similarly constructed. And then fourth is the need to build the trust and the legitimacy of a government. I mean, particularly when you come out of a violent conflict and where the government actually was part of the conflict, you need to be able to build the trust and legitimacy of the government. I mean, it's a point that is very much driven home by the World Development Report 2011 of the World Bank, and it really touched upon what Emmy talks about in a paper also about NGOs, and I think would put the international community in the same frame of doing all the delivery. The Minister of Development Cooperation of Riesbach of Denmark has this great story about, when he went to Afghanistan and he went to a village and he was asking the local, what has the end of the war meant for you? It's like, we have a school there and a health facility there and we have a well there. And who built it? Yeah, well, it's, it's UNDP and it's FAO who built the well. And that's all what they had associated with. And that has actually changed quite a bit, I think, over the last few years. And that now, less flags, and recognizing that the government is actually delivering, and that the international community steps back a little bit in that regard. So I leave it here.
Great, thanks, Hank Gallen. Making the important point that it's important not just to do conflict-sensitive programming, but to emphasize programming that has a peace-building dynamic. And then you didn't just leave us there, you gave us 4 ways to think about doing that. So that's really appreciated. Ed Carr, to finish off with some comments from his perspective.
Well, thank you all for having me. Thank you for inviting me back. It's nice to see sort of the outcome of this process that did start a while ago. Quick caveat at the front end of this, which is that it was a lot easier to talk about these kinds of reports when you're either just an academic or just in the government, but when you have a foot in each world, you end up schizophrenic. And so I'm going to end up tacking somewhere between 30,000 feet in the ground as I make some comments, ideally making a soft landing, not digging a big hole, but we'll see how that goes. So just to reiterate some of the things that people have said, this report has some really, really interesting stuff in here, especially in terms of the literature reviews. I do think they're really worth reading and looking through. And of course, they tell us 2 things to reiterate what everyone's been saying here. It's pretty clear that conflict can and does impact food security. And there are a lot of different pathways by which this can happen. The big caveat, of course, is that conflict doesn't affect everybody in the same way. And I think we've heard versions of that concern pop up over and over on this panel. And I think that that's a really big deal because, again, to point out what I forget who said this earlier, I think Emmy said this earlier, yeah, country level analysis becomes very problematic here. It's very difficult to talk about this at that level. I'm going to focus a lot more on the other side of this, the more difficult side, right? It's a lot less clear how food security impacts political unrest and conflict. There's a lot of plausible pathways out there. We know that. I think a lot of them are laid out in this report. But there's only one hard finding in the literature, if you really dig through a lot of the literature, right, which is that food price increases can play a role in political unrest and conflict. And I said food price increases. Precision matters here. Food price instability doesn't seem to do that. So you have to actually split this apart. Mark Belmar has pretty much demonstrated that statistically. So we have to think very carefully about our terms here and what we're actually trying to address. But what I'd also point out is that the lit review here, I think, captures the state of literature and that it's leaving kind of 2 big questions out there, right? The first of them, how exactly is it that food prices translate into political unrest and conflict? This is something we need to know if we're going to do anything about this. I think Emmy's 5 points that she put up are a good summary, and to her credit and to the report's credit, there's no overstating of the case here. The literature is pretty indeterminate. We're trying to get some sense of what's going on. Why does this happen in some places and at some times, but not in other places at other times? It seems to me that the conflict food security linkage suffers from the same problem that an awful lot of the environment and conflict literature suffers from, which is there are more negative cases than positive cases. In other words, you have a lot of cases where there's a price spike and no violence or no conflict, more than you do cases that it does happen. It becomes very difficult for analysis. And I think this goes to Susan's point, which you kept referring to as her sort of squishy comments, but as a qualitative researcher, I love squishy comments. The determinants of conflict aren't all that deterministic, really. And that becomes a big challenge. But Susan, thank you for saving me from my 5-minute divergence on why we need more qualitative research. You covered it, so I don't have to do that. This broad concern here, again, how do food prices translate into unrest and conflict, leads to another important question, which is how important, in fact, is food security in the genesis of political instability and conflict? I ask this as a sort of programming and practical sort of note, right? In some cases, it's obviously really important, and we need to deal with that. But what are the cases in which it plays only a really small role? What if it's the 7th, 8th, 10th most important thing going on in a particular conflict situation? If it's that far down the line, is this something that USAID or any other donor organization should be looking at, or should they be dealing with the first 6 problems? And this is something we have to sort out if we're actually going to program against this. You know, budgets are not infinite, resources are not infinite, so we have to think about what we're doing here. So this all then leads me, now I go up to 30,000 feet. This all leads me to really kind of a meta question. What are we trying to accomplish when we design and implement food security programs? I think we have to ask this in the context of thinking about food security and conflict. Development challenges are really complex, and they're usually interrelated. This is why sectoral programming often fails to live up to expectations, because if you only hit one of the things, you can't hit all the different things that are going on in a particular situation. I'm a really big fan of integrated programming, but there's also, in integrated programming, always the danger of mission creep, where you set out to do one thing and you suddenly find yourself trying to achieve all kinds of other goals. So the real question here is the reduction of conflict a development goal unto itself, or is it the means to the achievement of other development goals? I think you can make a case for either one. It's just not clear to me that the case has actually been made and pinned down really firmly. And I think that actually may vary organization to organization, which is going to give us some significant challenges here. Let me point out why I think this is important. I'll give you a quick example here. It's what in social theory we would call the problem of overdetermination, which is, you know, causes have causes, have causes, have causes. So ultimate causality becomes a really difficult thing to trace out. When we talk about food security contributing to conflict, is that what we really mean? I'll just give you a hypothetical scenario. You're in a rural area somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa. At the onset of the rainy season, there's unusually heavy rains, washes out some of the road network, linking some of these communities to their local markets. People can't get their crops to market, and say they're growing cash crops like cotton or something like that. Cotton's not terribly useful if you can't get it to market. You can't eat it, it doesn't have a lot of value locally. So as a result, you now don't have the resources you need perhaps to meet your food needs in the household. At the same time, if the roads are washed out, maybe you can't access normal sources of non-farm employment, which also would diversify your livelihoods, get you some income, and you could buy food. So incomes drop, livelihoods are now less resilient if any other shocks come along, and great, the rest of the rainy season suddenly comes in dry. This does happen sometimes, right? So at that point, whatever crops you had in the fields are now going to get decimated too. So now you're really food short, you pretty much have no money, and let's just say people decide that that's it, we have to go to the government, we need to go get help. The government hasn't been responsive, so they march on, say, the district headquarters or something like that and demand help. And the state, of course, doesn't provide any help, thus precipitating some kind of a riot outside the gates of this particular government ministry. In this scenario, do we want to say that food security was the cause of the riot? Is it a contributing factor to the riot? Or was it a state that lacked capacity to maintain its infrastructure in the face of climate variability or meet the emergency needs of its people? A problem that we could probably trace back to colonialism, if you really want to get to sort of ultimate causes there. Or was this a problem of climate variability, which flooded the roads and parched the crops? I raise this because, you know, while root causes aren't always addressable or even necessarily knowable, if you really want to get down to it, we need to understand what it is we're trying to address when we design and implement development programs. So calling the conflict scenario, the scenario I just laid out, a conflict scenario that's the product of food insecurity, I worry that that seems to potentially stretch the concept of food security past sort of useful boundaries when we think about designing and programming. And this is something I think that Susan was starting to warn about on the conflict side. We risk turning food security into a term much like poverty, in that it encompasses so much stuff and so many different things that it's actually not really an analytic term anymore. Battling poverty doesn't mean much. What do you mean? Do you mean incomes? Do you mean health? Do you mean access to food, which sometimes gets lumped under poverty? Same thing, we run a real danger here that food security becomes this giant encompassing thing that doesn't give us much analytic purchase. And I think that this is hugely important because food security work is already plagued with a bunch of crisis narratives that may or may not be terribly productive, including sort of this coming famine narrative that seems to lurk behind a lot of what we do. And these narratives can contribute to really problematic decisions, pushing production as the solution for problems we see globally when, there are all kinds of different contributing factors, waste being one of the really big ones. So I guess one of the things that was going for me in the background as I was reading the report was to think about asking for serious caution on everybody's part when we mix food security concerns and concerns over conflict and political unrest. Because in the worst case scenario, of course, if the concerns for conflict and unrest start to become the drivers of what's going on, they can become the excuses for really problematic decisions and really unproductive programming potentially. So, what do we do? To the credit of the report, it goes well beyond just a review and critique, and I'm going to try to do the same thing here. Very unacademic of me, I know. I want to address a recommendation that's running through the report. One I like a lot, but one that I think requires some clarification and focus, and that's linking sort of humanitarian assistance programming to development assistance programming. It's incredibly difficult to work across these two lines. I think that the report does mention this, but I think you should have been waving a flag on this repeatedly. I mean, I spent 2 years at USAID, 1 year on each side of this divide, and one of the things I was trying to do was find a way across this barrier, and I can tell you I failed miserably. And I was working with really smart, willing colleagues inside the agency on both sides. Okay, so this is not a problem of personnel. It isn't, and I know, Emmy, you know this, this is not something that would shock anybody, I think, inside I don't see Susan looking surprised to hear this news. We need to do more of this. But there are a lot of really difficult things that have to happen before this can go down. Because development assistance money and humanitarian assistance money, they have different mandates, they come from different funding sources, they operate on different timelines, and in many cases, I found out they actually have different understandings of the same terms. And so just trying to get people around a table to have a conversation could lead to an hour of Monty Python-esque circularity while no one could actually figure out what anyone else was saying, and no one knew it until like 45 minutes into the meeting that you actually meant something different by that term. And again, I say this with a bunch of smart, willing people in the room. Imagine when you start running into sort of institutional barriers. At USAID, to address this sort of thing, a lot of this work would actually have to be programmed in parallel. You couldn't really program an integrated project because the HA money, the humanitarian assistance money, and the development assistance money can't actually be mixed. And that creates a giant challenge, right? Because you basically have to all do handshakes and say, okay, you cover this half, you cover this half, and then you have to hope your implementing partners all get along, which is a little challenging too, to make all of this happen. That said, it needs to happen. Not just for conflict and food security, by the way. There's all kinds of areas in which I think this is really important. But there's a lot of learning that's going to happen at the institutional level. And this goes to Henk Jan's point about needing a lot of learning, I think. One thing that didn't show up as much here, but I think would be a useful recommendation, is to start piloting stuff at a very small level and at a manageable level, because there's so much learning that has to happen. There are so many barriers, some of which you won't find out about till you actually try to do something on the ground, that I would suggest that that's one place to start learning about how to do this kind of work so that you can sort of productively address a lot of this. And the good news on this front is that, at least from the American perspective, while food security is, at least it sounds like a whole of government issue, it's mostly a USAID issue. USAID is clearly the US government's point of contact and point on crisis situations overseas, so all of the acute food insecurity stuff is really coming through USAID. Though I should note that Food for Peace, which is the office that does the acute food insecurity work, also does do agricultural development work. So they kind of have a little bit of dual mandate. They're a little past just relief. And of course, USAID is doing the bulk of the work on Feed the Future. Not everything, but certainly the vast majority of it. And the good news is that that means you've got both sides of this divide when we think about food security in the same agency as CMM, and it's a lot easier to work inside an agency, though it's challenging, than it is to start working across agencies with all these challenges. So there is a great opportunity there. So just to kind of sum this up, I think the report does bring out what we do know about the connections between conflict and food security, and it also sort of highlights a great deal of what we don't know, and that is really important to do. I think that really needs to be put on the table. But until that research gets done and sort of informs what we know, and by the way, there's nothing an academic loves more than the phrase, more research is needed. And I can tell you account numbers as necessary. There are a couple of just things. Until we get that work done, we need to be careful about what we're using food security programs to achieve. I think we just have to think very carefully about that all the time. We need to be careful not to let work that mixes conflict and food security concerns become the source of more crisis narratives, either on the conflict side or on the food security side, that possibly drive either one of those in unproductive directions. I think we really need to be pretty humble in the face of the institutional challenges that stand between us and the programming of work that integrates climate concerns, concerns for acute food insecurity, and concerns for chronic food insecurity. And finally, it's really good news that we're actually having this conversation. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Ed. Our audience has been enormously patient. We have lots of great stuff on the table, if you will. What I will propose is that we take 3 or 4 questions at a time, and then we'll let the panelists weigh in as appropriate to respond. I'll ask from our panelists to be very succinct with your responses so that we can leave more time for audience input. So with that, if you could raise your hand, a microphone will be handed to you. And then if you could introduce yourself, tell us who you are and who you're with so that we have a sense of who we have with us today. Okay? Yes.
Hi, my name's Shelley Snyder. I'm in the Office of Population at USAID. And you all were discussing underlying causes, and I have to say from where I sit, a big underlying cost is the rapid population growth in many of these conflict-ridden countries. And I'd just like to point out that there are over 200 million women worldwide who would like to use family planning methods and don't have access to them. And so, and then when we were talking about the stunting issues and things like that for young children, those children who are born during conflict times have especially tough roads to hoe in the years to come. So I would just like to put in a little plug for voluntary family planning issues in conflict and food security issues.
Great, thank you. Other question, right behind Shelley. Thank you.
Thank you. Mark Cohen from Oxfam America. If I can mimic Ed Carr a little bit, and you'll permit, Joe, I'd like to ask an academic question and then a practical programming question. So the academic question for Emmy is, going back to your 5 bullets about how food insecurity can influence conflict outcomes, it seems to me, and I think you go into more detail on this in the report, but you're also addressing a debate from a few years ago about greed versus grievance. Do grievances matter? Does mobilizing political support around issues matter? Or is it all a question of just who gets to have the lootable resources? And the Wilson Center put out a book some years ago edited by William Zartman and Cynthia Arnson on this topic, where they sort of came down, I think, on the grievance side, or as Zartman put it, the intersection of need, greed, and creed. So if you could maybe say a bit more about that. And then on the practical programming side for Susan, if I could push you a little bit. I mean, you said you haven't drunk all of the Kool-Aid that Joe's purveying with the framework, but at the same time, you're taking some baby steps. And if you could say a little bit more about how thinking about conflict sensitivity is influencing programming. I mean, thinking back to the 1980s, we know what conflict insensitive agricultural development looked like, giving lots and lots of money to 1980s Somalia and pre-genocide Rwanda. So kind of what lessons maybe have been learned. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Mark. Can we have one other? Yep.
Hi, I'm Shilpa Nadhan from the International Organization for Migration, and I had more of a ancillary question. I wanted to know, Ms. Simmons or anyone on the panel, if you had come across a lot being written about the idea of food speculation and organizations like Goldman Sachs and other investment banks essentially betting on food prices and on a larger scale energy prices and how that affects conflict, and if there's anything that the development community can do to maybe exert pressure on either regulating or curbing food price speculation and perhaps how it could affect insecurity.
Great, thank you. Let's start with those and get the panelists a quick round. Not everybody has to weigh in on every question, but we've got one on family planning as it relates to population. Mark's question, sort of a twofold about the causes of conflict, as well as a practical question for you, Susan, I think, about how conflict-sensitive programming, how you've worked with that, and then finally this question about food speculation. So you can weigh in on any of those on any particular order. Susan, do you want to start?
No, but I will. Actually, I appreciate the question because I certainly had a lot more that I could say about it. But I think the easiest thing to point out is probably the work we're doing in resilience, where there is a deliberate focus on conflict dynamics, peace building. And it's interesting, it kind of goes back to, Eric, you were talking about pilots. And I think we're doing the pilots now, beginning with the Horn, beginning with this 2011 crisis, and the incredible vulnerability that was sort of re-seen in the Horn. My bureau, DCHA, Africa Bureau, pulled together and actually did joint program analysis, joint program design. In the Horn, initially not such a great job of actual integration of resources, with the exception of this idea of conflict modifiers that OFDA has been instrumental in developing, which actually enable development programs to absorb emergency resources when needed and sort of expand activities to provide something of an activity safety net, if you would. In the Sahel, we've done a much better job at bringing different resource streams, water, climate change, nutrition resources, global health resources, all into the same program. So those pilots are going on. And as I said, both do include conflict. And the other thing I would say that we're doing differently is really on the ag side, particularly, really focusing in on policy. And although, it may seem like focusing in on a trade policy or inputs policy doesn't have a direct link to this, it does, because getting that policy infrastructure created where you're engaging civil society, you've got voice, you've got transparency, all of that in the long term is helping to vaccinate, if you will, a population. It's empowering people, particularly if you're looking at smallholder voice on up. So I would argue that is a very important piece of our approach to sort of conflict-sensitive programming.
Other contributions?
Mark asked a question about the greed and grievance, and you notice how I actually avoided that in the paper. Partly because I found that there was lots of evidence on both sides, and that the divide between those two kinds of theories of conflicts is less clear. Some people could say that, well, people wanting to be food secure is, greedy. I think that's arguable. And I think that the sense of injustice that Henk Jan actually underscored as well really came out in a lot of the micro work, where people felt that they were food insecure, they recognized they were food insecure, and they didn't think it had to be that way. Maybe because of policy, maybe because of discrimination, maybe because of corruption. And so, if that's a grievance, then that's one of the factors. So I don't think the picture is clear, and I didn't think it was necessary in this discussion to actually come down on that academic sort of debate, because I think there's lots of ways of casting it on both sides. I wanted to address the other question on food speculation, which again, that's kind of a post-2008 kind of question, because I know since 2008 there's been a lot of questions to whether that spike in prices, which obviously has been succeeded by higher prices again, and back in that picture, 2011, the prices actually are much higher than they were in 2008. I would just direct you to a book called Endless Appetites, which actually sort of is beginning that discussion of how the way that the global food trade is organized and financed may or may not be contributing to sort of global price movements in a way that we still don't understand. So that's an important point. I think that in looking at the literature, and it's too bad Mark Melmar is not here, because he spent a lot of time looking at the North African Arab Spring kinds of issues. And there's some question there whether, in fact, sort of cycles of speculation in food prices and the commoditization of food in global commodity markets, or global securities markets. I guess it's a securitization of food in global securities markets. How that played out in terms of particularly Egypt's decision to cut subsidies. But the picture is pretty murky. So if you have any more information on that, I'd be delighted to have it, and I'm sure Jan would as well. Because I think it is a kind of a new area of thinking about how global food commodity markets work, and sort of the levels of buffering and the level of regulation that they have.
Just quickly to follow, yes, exactly. Just quickly to follow on from Emmy, just one thing to think about, again, terms matter a lot, precision matters a lot. Remember that the real finding we have here is that price increases are sort of linked to conflict. But when we get into speculation in markets, all you need is price instability, because instability is arbitrageable, right? So there isn't necessarily a clear linkage here, because just that investment may or may not drive a spike in prices. It could also drive drops in it, because if you short it, then you win too. So all you need is for it to keep moving around. What you don't want is dead-on stability if you're invested in this field. So that's something that people need to be looking at right there, is exactly what kinds of influences are taking place in these markets, because then we can start to figure out if there's follow-on impacts that then get into these issues.
Yeah, maybe adding onto that. Indeed, we have to be very careful about terminology. Speculation is not only happening in financial markets. I mean, Peter Timmer did this great little back-of-the-envelope calculation about the rice price, which shot up in 2008 from about $300 a metric ton to at one point $1,500 wholesale when Philippines tried to buy, I think it was in May 2008. And if you have about 2 billion consumers of rice in the world, and they have normally 5 kilos of rice on the shelf to just cover daily consumption, and then suddenly prices shoot up so much, and they buy 10 kilos of rice to have on the shelf to make sure that the price tomorrow is because the price tomorrow is expected to be higher. That's speculation as well. And so I do think we have to be a little bit careful about this long chain of analysis that you refer to, which I completely agree with, and linking that to food insecurity. I mean, I do think, indeed, when I was at the World Food Program, I did some work on this as well. This commoditization of in the financial markets, I think, did play a role in 2008, and some regulation of that is indeed called for. But that's I think slightly different from this discussion here, where we link it to conflict, and very much agree with Mark. Actually, that the debate greed versus grievance, I think, is really actually a little bit of a non-issue, because I think there are many factors in place, and both probably play a role. And I think actually Paul Collier will admit that framing that debate. I don't think he will frame that debate.
He's more squishy now.
Exactly. He is definitely more squishy. I think he won't frame that debate anymore in those terms.
Great. Other questions? Yes, please.
I'm Helen Raffel with Resources for the Future, and my eye keeps coming back to the question mark at the end of your second thought, Emmy. So I wonder if you could give us a quick summary of the pros and cons, what the question mark is standing for.
Great. Other questions? So moving up the row, and then we'll get down here.
Hi, I'm Amanda Conklin with the Asian Development Bank. A lot of your recommendations for approaching the food security issue have come back to institution building, institution capacity. And I was wondering how do you recommend, the vision you see for building this institution capacity? Obviously, USAID as a government agency can, kind of advocate more democracy institution building, like the theory in Emmy's report mentions that democratic governments are a lot more respondent to food security crisis. So I'm just interested in how do you approach institution building, or does it vary country to country?
Great question. Let's take two more. I saw one on this side, and then down here in the third row. Why don't we start over there?
Hi, I'm Vicki Cao. I work at the Department of Commerce looking at food insecurity from a trade perspective. My question is, if you could talk about whether there is and how high it is, the correlation between a domestic civil society network to the internal conflict of a specific country. For example, in this country, we have Feeding America, we have pro bono law centers that really help to stabilize, our country on a day-to-day basis. So it's not really just government versus people. So, with your point, the representative from UN, about international assistance needing to stand back so that the government could put its brand more on things, do you also see the need to build up the civil society structures of those countries?
Great, and then one more.
Hi, I'm Tara Ennis, doctoral candidate at University of Maryland. My question is about the connection. So looking at the two relationships from security to food security to conflict, and conflict to food security together, it seems to introduce a strange kind of contradiction, and that if it's a very easy question to answer, that the effects of the effects of conflict on food security, why then is conflict a good solution for people who are looking for food security, who are suffering from food security? It seems like logically it doesn't make a lot of sense for them to engage in conflict in order to try and increase their access to food if the effect generally is that it decreases that access. If you could just address any what came out of your research of why that decision gets made, even though it seems somewhat illogical.
Okay, great. There are 4 questions. I'm not going to try to summarize them in the interest of time. So I will let people volunteer to jump in. If you want a second to think.
I can start on 2, and then the other 2.
Okay, why don't you go ahead?
Okay. Let me start on the question from the lady from Resources for the Future on breaking the cycle through agriculture development, right? Given this close relationship between conflict and food security, and food insecurity and conflict, the question that I posed was, is agricultural development, is an investment in agricultural development potentially more useful in averting conflict, and particularly, I think, in averting reignition of conflict than other kinds of interventions? Partly because it addresses directly in a post-conflict situation, it addresses directly one of the known outcomes of the conflict, which is a worse food situation, and that it has positive benefits in that it puts people back to work. It's something that a lot of people know how to do. It engages the government, or it engages the international community in addressing specific issues that need to be solved. Removal of landmines, rebuilding of roads, reestablishing markets, getting money into people's hands. So it seems to me, and this is again why I really feel that the linkage between the USAID's emphasis on Feed the Future and thinking about how that can work in fragile and conflict-affected situations is so important, because there's so many reasons why agriculture development is a terrific tool for, particularly for recovering from conflict and for preventing reignition. Just because, Well, because I posed it as a question. Other people say, well, no, and I'm going to let Hank Yan talk about institution building, capacity building, putting in schools. Because one of the arguments is that, well, what you need to do, and this comes from the health community as well, that because health always suffers, right? Putting in, and that's a utilization part of food security, putting in health clinics and getting kids vaccinated and getting that up to getting kids in school, that those are really the priorities. And of course, what seems to be the case, especially again in post-conflict situations, is that everything needs to be done at once. And often the agriculture development, because it's more complicated, it requires more expertise, et cetera, sort of gets put on the second burner, and the health and education agendas advance more quickly. That's just an observation. But Sue.
Yeah, no, I think the question mark deserves to be there. Even if we're looking at Feed the Future or focus countries, the great majority of Feed the Future focus countries that we talk about actually have yet to go through what's called sort of agricultural transformation, and they are agriculture-based societies. The bulk of the population is engaged in agriculture, depends on agriculture for their livelihoods. This isn't the same in many of the countries that have had food riots, and so agriculture isn't always going to be, I think, the answer. Employment is such an incredible piece of the picture, and is easily translatable into this idea of perceived food security. It's not, can I work my field? It's, do I have $1 in my pocket? And so I think the question mark is deserved. I think agriculture is probably critically important in most countries, particularly in Africa, but it's not true across the board.
Hank Yan?
No.
Just a few additions. I think the question mark should also partly be there, maybe slightly different reasons. Partly, I think it's the question of how you do it, I think is very difficult. But also because of it's the food increase that is so important. Often perhaps, social protection systems are very important on top of agricultural development. If I may just also address a couple of other questions. The one on institution building, I think I absolutely agree. This is what peace building to a large extent is about. The Secretary General of the UN put out a report on peace building at the end of last year, and there were three themes there: inclusivity, institution building, and sustained support. And we're really talking about the long-term, 20, 30 years that is really necessary. Also, the point on civil society, that actually pertains to that inclusivity theme that I chose. Very important. It's not only about state-society relationship, but also about society-society relationships, and the social cohesion that I talked about. Civil society is really the glue that holds our countries together. So building those networks, and the UN is doing a lot of work also in post-conflict countries, including my office through the Peace Building Fund in Libya and in Yemen, supporting youth and women's networks to really make sure that these civil society networks are having an ameliorating and social cohesion building role. Very good question about this apparent contradiction. I think 2 points that I would make on that. it's not so much the level as the change in prices, so in particular the increase in prices. And I do think there is actually some evidence that when you're really destitute, then people don't engage in conflict. I mean, there is nothing but than what they care about, and it's getting some food. So what we see in the Arab Spring, it's they're not. They're not starving, they're not destitute in terms, but they spend still, actually in a lot of our North African countries, they still spend about 40-50% of their expenditures on food. So if prices increase even by 10% or 20%, let alone the increases that we saw in the lead up to the Arab Spring, that really affects their food security. So that, I think, is really the critical aspect, and that the people are angry about that or have grievances about that. I think that's very much understood.
Can I make just one extra comment on that? Because I think that addressed your very thoughtful question. Why would people who are food insecure already support conflict? And the point is that many of them can't avoid it. That in fact conflict rolls through an area, a geographic area, and many of those households, many of those businesses have to make a choice. That especially if they're already food insecure. If I flee, will I be more food insecure? If I stay here and maybe collaborate, can I protect my food security? So I think that this is a really complex behavioral choice kind of question. And again, it's why I point to the microeconomic literature that's coming out now, because people are finding that this is a really complicated choice, and that there's been sort of virtually no capacity on the part of the external help to really address this, especially in a time of violent conflict where things are going forward. But I think recognizing that, and it contributes to the breakdown in social networks, because those who do collaborate because they think, in fact, they might be able to preserve whatever food security level they have, even if it's not very high, when the people who flee come back, they say, you guys. And so that rebuilding of the civil society, that rebuilding then of the community that's necessary to take positive steps and to build peace and to go forward, that becomes more complicated. So I think that understanding that in fact that households have different responses, different reactions, they make different calculations as to their relationship to conflict, even if they're not directly engaged. That's an important part, I think, of this new literature.
Right. Ed, did you want to?
Yeah, just very quickly on the institution building question, which I thought was a very good question. It actually, there was something in the report that actually made me a little bit anxious, I think, and that was sort of how the report talks a little bit about institution building. I know you didn't mean it this way at all, so I want to be very clear about that. But if you're reading this quickly, there's an implication almost that there aren't institutions, or there aren't functioning institutions. And what I'm concerned with is a little bit of us focusing on what institutions are actually in a given place, if we're going to talk about institution building. Because I do most of my work in sub-Saharan Africa, where the state, and I work in rural sub-Saharan Africa, so the state is a mildly amusing institution to me most of the time. It has very little legitimacy and very little capacity to operate in the places that I tend to do my work. However, most legitimacy and political authority is local and based in access to land and things like that, and there isn't a lot of connection between them. So we have to think about which institutions are there, which ones are functioning, which ones we want to work with, because building state capacity may or may not have anything to do with what needs to get done in a particular place. At the same time, when we talk about building capacity, let's just say the state is the right place to do it. We have to think very carefully about what we mean by building state capacity. There's a big push, for example, toward decentralization these days, which is assumed to make government more responsive to the local population. Except that a lot of decentralization just takes the folks from the central bureaucracy, sticks them out in districts or other areas. They're not locally elected, they're still appointed by the capital. So as a result, they don't care what the local population says, because the local population doesn't do anything to determine their job. They still only care about what's coming out of centralized government, so things don't get any more responsive. So have we actually built any sort of institutional capacity when that kind of thing happens? The simple point is just that I agree that there needs to be a lot of focus on institutions, but which institutions and what kind of focus is, I mean, it's a second report, right? Or 3 or 4 major reports.
Great, thank you, Ed. Let's get some more questions. There had been a question in the back of the room. Yes, please. We'll get 2 or 3, maybe 4 more.
Hello, my name is Danielle Edwards, and I'm with the Public International Law and Policy Group. Mr. Carr posed the question, why do conflicts happen in some countries and not others? And my question is this: do you think that conflict is more likely to happen in countries that suffer from food insecurity but also are afflicted by the resource curse? For example, Sierra Leone, where rebels have an interest in controlling the diamond industry. Do you think that the incidence of that sort of phenomena precipitates conflict in countries that suffer from food insecurity?
Okay. Right here in the middle? Yes, please. Can you turn the microphone on? Maybe send him can we go to the bullpen and bring in a reliever?
There we go.
Okay, is it on? Good.
Yeah.
My name is Phil Thomas. I'm an affiliate faculty member at George Mason University, and I'd like to ask Susan Bradley particularly this question. What more can be done by the Feed the Future initiative to deal with food security problems in an emergency setting? You know, historically there has been some disagreement over whether Food for Peace emergency programs should be integrated as part of the Feed the Future initiative. And, you know, Feed the Future essentially is all about integration. And it's not just long-term integration, but short-term as well. And I was wondering what more could be done.
Okay, and I just want to check on the time. I know we're at the top of the hour. If we can indulge the audience for 5 minutes, we'll have one more question, and then I'll ask the panelists to be very quick with the answers to these. One more question? There's one down here in the 4th row.
Thank you. Is this the one that's on?
Yeah.
Great. I'm Lynn Brown from the World Bank, and I think there's an interesting thing on whether food insecurity leads to conflict based on an implied contract or even an explicit contract between a government and its people. So if you think of the Arab Spring area, or you think of, for example, Asia, there's some very explicit contracts. In the Arab Spring countries, there's food subsidies in many of those countries. In Asia, most Asian countries actually manipulate the price of the rice market all the time. So you have some very explicit statements by government that they're involved in food. And so when that changes and the prices go up, it looks like a state failure to people, and it's possibly more likely to lead to riots. But if that's the case, then maybe we need to look at the policies that are being put in place. Are those policies that are bad policies and will lead to riots? So, for example, if you look in Egypt, the food subsidy system there has produced a population that by the age of 40 to 45, 85% of adults are overweight or obese. And yet children under 2 are still stunted, because the way the food's subsidized actually creates an unbalanced diet that doesn't support the growth of a child. I lived in Bangladesh for 2 years, and I would argue that the way they manipulate the price system there actually keeps farmers poor and stops them breaking out of poverty and food insecurity. And then if you think of another country in South Asia at the minute that's just passed a bill to actually give massive amounts of food to its poor people, which it singularly failed to do in the past and probably can't deliver well in the future, one wonders what expectation does that create? And instead of being something for food security, is it actually something that's going to link food security to conflict in the future?
I'm going to take the prerogative of the chair, and I'm going to answer the first question about where do we know where conflict is more likely to happen in the face of things like food insecurity or resource curses. Our office has been doing a lot of work on just assessing the conflict vulnerability of countries, and we have really focused very carefully on something that's already come up, the relationships between state and society, where those relationships are producing outcomes that are considered to be fair, effective, legitimate. The likelihood for conflict is low. And when we measure this stuff, and our office does measure it in a pretty rigorous way, we can figure out which countries really exhibit the highest levels of problems. We call it fragility, where those relationships are not producing effective and legitimate outcomes. We look across the world at the 50 countries, and there are about 50 countries that are conflict affected. Close to 90% of them exhibit high levels of fragility. Okay, so fragility is a huge part of the story in explaining conflict vulnerability. Where food insecurity exhibits itself in combination with fragility, the likelihood for conflict is high. Where food insecurity comes to pass in the face of low levels of fragility, the risks of conflict are low. And so it's that overlay between where we see food insecurity and fragility that we're primarily concerned. Where food insecurity happens, where that isn't the case, there are probably conflict mitigating factors in place that are going to work in ways that are productive and to produce nonviolent outcomes that are responsive to people in the face of food insecurity. So that would be my quick answer to that question. Let me turn to the panel to weigh in on any of the things you just heard.
Susan, do you want to do
Phil.
Phil's question first?
Hi,
I'll
Phil.
take on Len, but I'd love to have Hank do it as well.
Phil and I go way back in this particular issue. You know Feed the Future inside and out, Phil. You probably know it just as well as I do at this point in time. So you know that it is committed to supporting country-led plans, country ownership, and there's a real implication there of sort of longer-term planning, a longer-term focus. Should that preclude the room to expand should an emergency occur and to actually spend more time assisting governments, our Feed the Future governments, anticipate those kinds of emergencies? I think you're right there. I think we should be able to do that. We have not been sorely tested yet, and we may be. I think that the fact that we do have development food assistance programs in many of our Feed the Future countries will help us actually do this kind of expansion, even if it hasn't up to now really changed, increased our focus on assisting governments prepare for crisis.
Other last comments?
Yeah, maybe one point to Lynn. The question on the social contract and the policies. I mean, I very much agree that policies with regard to food can definitely be improved. But we do, what I think is important is that we not only take an economic lens from that. We not, what the World Bank did at one point, give a green light, an orange light, and a red light, just based on, what the economic analysis tells you. Because, as Peter Timmons said, rice is a highly political commodity. And actually, Indonesia and India were very successful to stabilize food prices, while the rest of the world was suffering from high food prices that are going through the roof. And there were elections right after that, and the incumbent got reelected. So this is what politics is about. I completely agree with you that a lot of the food subsidies in Northern Africa, for example, are highly inefficient and are not really targeting food security in terms of the broad spectrum going from nutrition to overnutrition and malnutrition. So that, I think, really needs to be a focus on. But that you do need to have a political economy lens in all of that to be able to do it right is absolutely critical. Thanks.
Thank you.
So going off the political economy lens, and it wouldn't be me if I didn't drop a giant bomb into the middle of a conversation at some point. So
End of the conversation, actually.
wouldn't be me if I didn't do that either. So, two questions here. Why do conflicts happen in some places but not others? And then a concern for sort of implicit and explicit contracts between the state and its people. Something that kind of comes to mind for me, it's been lurking for me for a while here, is how about the question of what happens when people can't escape the state or markets? And this is an important question. I mean, we are pushing food security programs that rely on a certain degree of state capacity. We're expecting certain kinds of market capacities. They often don't exist in the places we work, which means that things can go horribly wrong for people who are sort of at the edges of those markets and those institutions. And one of the traditional ways, I've seen this in my own work in several countries in sub-Saharan Africa, a lot of other people have traced this in other parts of the world. The way that a lot of these poor and rural populations deal with this is actually through what amount to escape hatches from this stuff, where you can pull out of markets. You can go to pure subsistence if you have to. You can run away, more or less, from a state that's failing or for markets that are turning against you. And I wonder if one of the answers to why it occurs in some places, not others, are in fact some of the places where some of these populations have no other choice. They can't run. So you're forced to confront the state. You're forced to confront the institutions that shape the markets because you don't have another choice anymore. I don't know, that was a whole new line of research, hence the bomb at the end of the conversation, I guess. But it's something to kind of look into. It sort of just occurred to me as we were talking.
Emmy, would you like the last word?
Gosh, there's been so many good words. I think Lynn sort of opened up a new door for some additional work going ahead, and I think Ed's already taken up the challenge. And Susan mentioned that, in fact, paying attention to the political economy is needed. I think where there are explicit contracts between the state and the food-consuming population, I think then, in fact, the potential for conflict, the potential for grievance, as it were, rises very, very quickly. But in fact, in most cases, maybe this goes to Ed's point, I have to think about this a bit more. In most cases where states are in fact responsible for doing policies or making policies and making investments, public investments, which affect food security, most people are kind of unaware of exactly how that relationship works. So I don't think that an implicit contract, for example, carries anywhere the same weight in terms of conflict and conflict risks. Where I keep coming back to, and this came out of the work, is that where we have the most opportunity both to engage and to learn, and I think to be most useful in terms of actual work on the ground, is in post-conflict situations. Because the possibility of reignition is extremely high. The sort of factors that led to conflict are kind of out there, so they're visible. The need to invest in recovery is palpable. And so it kind of gives a framework, going back to Susan's point, it gives a framework for sort of really focusing on what needs to be done, what can be done, what partnerships need to be built, how institutions in a post-conflict era need to be recreated or restructured for building peace. Because I think it has to be done proactively. I mean, I'm totally in agreement with Henk-Jan on this. It has to be done proactively. Just assuming that somehow social networks are going to reform, or that governments are going to be, the post-conflict governments are going to be sort of responsive and understanding the issues and explicitly incorporating them into policy going forward, does not seem to be the case. So I think that is, if I were sitting in Susan's shoes and kind of looking forward, I would be paying a lot of attention right now to Mali. I would be paying a lot of attention to Liberia. I would be paying a lot of attention to South Sudan, because those are countries in which the potential for reignition and for things going really wrong and for not having a food security recovery or a food secure recovery are, I think, still quite high. So I think there's plenty of opportunities to work, and I'm really thrilled to have been on this panel of people who are engaged and thinking and pushing the envelope with regard to what we know, what we still don't know, and what we need to know and need to pilot and test going forward. So I think we've laid out a rich menu here for you today, and obviously keep those cards and letters coming. Joe Hewitt right here.
Let me say this in closing. I mean, one of the things you see here is that this is a problem, food security and conflict, that's going to require collaborative effort across people who are food security experts, people from the humanitarian assistance part of the work of USAID, and the development assistance part of USAID. This work creating this report involved very valuable contributions from our colleagues in the Bureau for Food Security, from our colleagues in the Office for Food for Peace. The Conflict Office had a role to play. This report defines a space where you can see the inputs from a variety of actors are going to be important. And so as you think about the work that you do and the value you bring to this, think about the collaborators that are really necessary to try to bring more progress to this. I want to thank our audience for first indulging us with a little extra time, and also for your very thoughtful questions. It's really made this conversation very rich. And if you could please join me in thanking the panelists for really a fantastic set of presentations.
You guys, thanks.
Thank you all very much, and have a great day.